this, but I thought that there had been studies of the hydrological system of Sukhothai, and I thought that had been inspired by UNESCO somewhere along the line, and I thought there were botanical studies of Sukhothai, and I had read a report probably 5 to 6 years ago, which suggested that there were other ways in which the site could be interpreted, which wasn't so fabric-centred. And I understood that the botanical studies were surprising because they thought that a lot of the exotics that were being grown in this area turned out to be plantings that went back to the 13th and 14th century. So there is possibilities, or at least material available that could begin to produce a different type of interpretation of the site. So that's the sort of statement / question. But I want to pick up also the idea of, if it's 70% of Thai people coming, and now picking up on what Sue said, do we need to reconceptualise heritage interpretation? And from my perspective, there is too much concern for a sort of dialogic relationship with heritage, which is about learning things. Last night we had a tremendous experience of going around in the bus and experiencing the site in an aesthetic and more somatic way. And to me that's as much as powerful an interpretation of the site as learning about the specificities and the actual the intricacies of the fabric. And it concerns me a little bit that the current interpretation at Sukhothai is like an encyclopedia, treating the site as though it's an encyclopedia in stone, and to be read in that way. If we are going to encourage and satisfy different types of visitors, that means there has to be other ways of connecting to site. We all know that placemaking is a complicated business and it's very multivarious. And there are really intricate ways in which we all connect to place and we make place. And it seems to me that interpretation has to start to move down and capture the intricate ways in which we connect to place. And so therefore, if I was given the task of thinking about broadening the interpretation away from a sort of fabric-centred encyclopedia in stone approach for local people, it would start by finding out what their connections are to place. What are the stories which animate their connections, and making those part of the way in which the site is both experienced and talked about. Narrative storytelling for me is very important, and it seems to be a very dominant and powerful way in which people can interact with sites. And we heard already, there's been a few mentions about the impact of digital technology, and certainly I've been interested in the last few years, even though I don't even have a Facebook site, but I've been interested in the last few years about the possibilities that digital media provide us, because it does give us a way for the first time to bring tangible and intangible together. It is possible to have multiplicities of narratives available. Yes, there are huge issues. There are issues around authorised interpretation versus unauthorised interpretation. Yes, there are issues around how do you control blogging, which might be unacceptable, etc., etc. But let's put all that aside for the moment and just see the potential of social media and the potential of digital media as a way of presenting multiple stories. I think that's where I'll stop.
Just one more from there.
Thanks, Russell. My name is Leda Elliott and I'm from Australia too. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of the points that have come out from this discussion. And for me, one of the things that I would really like to see is some idea of the social context in which these great historical sites existed. I didn't get any feeling as to how people related to them. The temples are there. I don't know whether anybody lived there. I mean, that's an extraordinary gap to come away from those sites. And Patricia's talked about the agricultural landscape around it and about the settlements and the townships. So where did people live? Where did they people who worshipped at these sites come from? There can't simply have been one colony of monks and nobody else. I don't have any idea about the general cultural and social context, and I think that that would be a very important way to think about interpretation generally, because that also links you now into how people are living now. And for me always, part of interpretation is to make a connection between what was in the past and what you see now, how people lived in the past and how they continue that or have changed from that in the present, so that you don't have the feeling that the past is dead, particularly in a country where tradition is so strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. You made a very good point. The table 3, actually. Come back to the table. Lynn would like to yes, something.
I once met somebody living in a World Heritage Site, and she said, "You can say nothing for us about us without us." And I think the World Heritage Sites, they are probably the most difficult pieces of landscape on Earth. There are it's so many uses. And if you're going into management, it is to find optimal use. Optimal use. You have to find everybody that's actually appearing doing things on this piece of land. And especially introducing community, we open up a vast area of knowledge that are, in a production sense, possible to be used also in tourism. But I agree with Sue, go into a process of activate all the possible knowledge, because it's not just archaeology. I'm sure a rare little butterfly could stop a vast archaeology project. You know, so let's pick them all up and use them, because it's a beautiful process. And from going away from mistrusting somebody, switch over and start trusting them, and the good ones will respond very positively. Thank you.
Very much. Yes, Jim?
The discussion has moved a lot towards interpretation, and my expertise has absolutely nothing to do with interpretation. And I sort of pause there for a second because I wanted to sort of go back to facility at this point, because my expertise is much more in circulation and site management, site design, transportation, and the biggest observation I have here in terms of just looking at the two sites is that there seems to be a lot of a disconnect between the circulation on the site and the circulation around the site, and that Randy talked about managing the more tourists that might be coming to the site over time. And hopefully it doesn't grow fast, but hopefully it grows moderately. But you do want to start to plan for those tourists that are coming here. They're not all going to be at the site. They have to get to the site, leave the site. And right now, the only way that most people do that is by some sort of a motor vehicle. And it's not easy to walk to a site. It's not easy to bicycle to a site. And that thinking about how you're going to manage just the circulation itself around the sites, how will people get in and out of these areas, and so that you're not creating a problem in the future. Such as the Taj Mahal, where they eventually had to pull things away from the site, and you can only walk there now. You don't want to get to a point where you have to do something like that. If you start thinking about how the whole community interacts with these sites in terms of circulation, in terms of people moving around the sites, going into the site, coming out of the site, going back and forth several times, coming out for lunch, going back in, becomes a way to make it either work quite well, so that you really don't notice. It sort of fulfills the idea that the cultural heritage site becomes more a part of the community over time, as opposed to an isolated element. Or it could create a lot of problems if you don't think about it. Our committee was in the Philippines last year looking at another World Heritage Site, and the only real way to see that site was to really walk around it and experience it. But it was impossible to walk around. Nothing had been planned to allow pedestrians to really experience the site, and yet that was the only good way to do it. So there was a very big problem there as well. So I always sort of focus on just physical planning around the site, making sure that the physical plan supports all the other things that you want to do. Because without that, they're not going to be able to experience all these other things because they're frustrated if they can't get in, or they're having problems, or whatever. And it sort of could taint the way they think about the site as they leave if you don't start to pay attention to those things. Thank you.
I wanted to say that we had a good discussion in our group about the fact that it is now an archaeological site, but that the archaeology is a little behind the curve. That even its core area of presentation is not up to current practice. For example, we went down a path of discussion that said, well, has archaeology asked the questions about what was planted and what grew next to these sites? Are they being presented in a way that we assume they were historically, or in a way that might have been accurate to the history? I mean, it's a very interesting concept to think